Picture this. You're standing outside Buckingham Palace on a crisp London morning, camera in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous royal guards in their iconic red uniforms and towering bearskin hats. These soldiers are known worldwide for their stone-faced discipline, their ability to stand motionless for hours, completely ignoring tourists who try everything from silly faces to loud noises to get a reaction. But what happens when a tourist's innocent mistake triggers something no one saw coming? What occurs when a royal guard breaks centuries of tradition in a split second that changes two lives forever? This isn't just another tourist story. This is about Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old teacher from Vancouver who traveled 4,800 miles to fulfill her late grandmother's dying wish. It's about Sergeant James Mitchell, a decorated soldier whose lightning-fast reflexes saved a life and revealed a secret that had been hidden for 70 years. In those 3 seconds outside the palace gates, a routine tourist photo became an international headline, a family mystery was solved, and two strangers discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen. You think you know how royal guards behave. You think you understand protocol, but you've never heard a story like this. What happened next will make you believe in destiny again. Sarah Chen had never been the type of person who believed in signs from the universe. As a practical high school math teacher from Vancouver, she preferred equations that had clear solutions and problems that could be solved with logic. But standing in her grandmother's empty bedroom 3 months ago, holding a faded photograph and a handwritten letter, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about coincidence and fate. The photograph showed a young woman in a 1950s dress standing next to a tall man in a Royal Guard uniform outside what was unmistakably Buckingham Palace. The woman looked exactly like Sarah's grandmother, Lily Chen, but that was impossible. Her grandmother had always told the family she had never left China until she immigrated to Canada in 1962. Yet here was photographic evidence suggesting otherwise. The letter, written in her grandmother's careful handwriting, had been tucked behind the photograph. It was addressed to Sarah and dated just 2 weeks before her grandmother's passing. The words still echoed in Sarah's mind as she sat on the plane to London, watching the clouds drift past her window. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "there are stories I never told. Secrets I kept to protect those I loved. By the time you read this, I will be gone. But I need you to know the truth. The man in this photograph was the love of my life. His name was Thomas Mitchell, and he was a Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. We met in 1953 during my brief time in London as a student. We were going to be married, but circumstances separated us forever. I never knew what happened to him, and I've wondered every day for 70 years. If you can find it in your heart to help an old woman's final wish, please go to London. Stand where this photograph was taken. Maybe somehow the universe will provide the closure I never found." Sarah had stared at that letter for hours, reading it over and over. Her logical mind told her this was an impossible task. How could she find information about a man who might not even be alive anymore? How could she fulfill such a vague request? But something deeper than logic had compelled her to book the flight, request leave from school, and embark on what she knew might be a completely pointless journey. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their descent into Heathrow Airport. Sarah looked down at the photograph in her lap, studying her grandmother's face. Even in the faded image, she could see the joy and love radiating from her expression as she looked up at the tall guard beside her. This wasn't just a tourist photo. This was a moment captured between two people deeply in love. London's sprawling cityscape came into view as the plane banked toward the runway. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken, not from fear of flying, but from the overwhelming reality of what she was attempting. She was a small-town teacher who had barely traveled outside her home province, and now she was in one of the world's largest cities chasing a 70-year-old ghost story. The customs line at Heathrow moved slowly, giving Sarah time to second-guess her decision for the 100th time. What was she really hoping to accomplish? Even if she found records of Thomas Mitchell, what were the chances he was still alive? And if he was alive, What right did she have to disrupt his life with news from a past he might prefer to keep buried? But every time doubt crept in, she thought of her grandmother's face in those final weeks. Lily Chen had been a woman of incredible strength, raising 5 children as a single mother after her husband's early death, building a successful restaurant business from nothing, and always putting everyone else's needs before her own. In all those years, Sarah had never seen her grandmother ask for anything for herself. This final request felt sacred, a debt of love that demanded payment. The taxi ride from the airport to her modest hotel near Russell Square gave Sarah her first real taste of London. The city was overwhelming in its age and grandeur, with buildings that had stood for centuries and streets that seemed to carry the weight of countless stories. She pressed her face to the window, watching red double-decker buses navigate impossibly narrow roads while pedestrians moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had mastered the art of urban survival. Her hotel room was small but clean, with a view of a busy street lined with shops and cafes. Sarah set her suitcase on the bed and pulled out the photograph again, studying every detail. The background clearly showed the gates of Buckingham Palace, the ornate ironwork and distinctive architecture unmistakable even in the black and white image. Her grandmother stood on the left side of the frame, while Thomas Mitchell stood at attention on the right, his ceremonial uniform perfectly pressed, his tall bearskin hat adding to his already impressive height. What struck Sarah most was the way they were looking at each other despite the formal pose. There was a tenderness in the guard's eyes that spoke of deep affection, and her grandmother's smile was unlike any expression Sarah had ever seen in family photographs. This was love, pure and simple, captured in a single moment before time and circumstances tore it apart. That evening, Sarah walked the streets around her hotel trying to absorb the reality of being in London. The city felt alive with history, every corner potentially hiding stories like her grandmother's. She stopped at a small restaurant and ordered fish and chips, listening to the conversations flowing around her in accents that ranged from posh BBC English to working-class Cockney. Tomorrow, she would begin her search. But tonight she allowed herself to simply exist in this place where her grandmother had once been young and in love. Back in her room, she called her mother in Vancouver, the 9-hour time difference making it early morning at home. "I'm here, Mom," she said when her mother's sleepy voice answered the phone. "I'm actually in London. Any regrets yet?" her mother asked with the kind of gentle teasing that came from deep love and concern. "A few thousand," Sarah admitted, "but I think Grandma would have done the same thing if our positions were reversed." "You know, there were always things about your grandmother's past that didn't quite add up. Little inconsistencies in her stories about her youth. Maybe you're about to discover why." That night, Sarah lay in her narrow hotel bed listening to the sounds of London settling into evening. Sirens wailed in the distance, late-night revelers laughed on the street below, and somewhere in the building's old pipes, water gurgled through ancient plumbing. She held the photograph against her chest and tried to imagine her grandmother walking these same streets 7 decades earlier, young and hopeful and believing in a future that would never come to pass. Tomorrow, she would go to Buckingham Palace. She would stand where the photograph was taken and try to figure out what came next. She had no plan beyond that, no strategy for uncovering the truth about Thomas Mitchell, or understanding what had separated him from her grandmother. All she had was a promise to a dying woman and a faded photograph that proved love had once existed in this vast, ancient city. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever forces governed coincidence and fate. If her grandmother's story was going to find its ending, she would need help from something greater than logic and planning. She would need the kind of miracle that brought strangers together across impossible odds. The kind of magic that could reach across 70 years and heal an old woman's broken heart, even from beyond the grave. The morning sun cast long shadows across St. James's Park as Sarah made her way toward Buckingham Palace, the photograph tucked carefully in her jacket pocket. She had woken before dawn, too nervous to sleep, and spent hours pacing her hotel room while rehearsing what she would say if anyone asked why she was taking pictures at the palace gates. The truth seemed too fantastical to share with strangers, but she had never been good at lying. London was different in the early morning. The frantic energy of the previous evening had given way to a quieter rhythm as the city slowly awakened. Delivery trucks rumbled past cafes where workers prepared for the breakfast rush, and early commuters hurried toward tube stations with the focused determination of people running on autopilot. Sarah felt like an outsider in this choreographed urban ballet, but there was something comforting about being anonymous in a city of 8 million people. As she approached the palace, the first thing that struck her was the sheer scale of everything. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, its pale stone facade imposing yet elegant in the morning light. The famous balcony where the royal family appeared for special occasions looked smaller than she had expected, but the overall effect was undeniably majestic. This was a place where history was made, where centuries of tradition continued despite the changing world beyond its gates. The area around the Victoria Memorial was already busy with tourists, even at this early hour. Sarah watched as people positioned themselves for selfies, their faces bright with excitement at being so close to royal history. She pulled out her grandmother's photograph and tried to identify the exact spot where it had been taken, comparing the background architecture with what she could see today. The gates themselves were magnificent works of art, intricate ironwork topped with golden details that caught the morning sun. Beyond them, she could see the gravel drive leading to the palace entrance. And somewhere in the distance, she caught her first glimpse of the famous guards in their red tunics and towering bearskin hats. They stood at their posts with absolute stillness, looking more like statues than living men. Sarah found what she believed was the correct location and pulled out her phone to take a comparison photo. As she lined up the shot, she noticed an older woman standing nearby, also taking pictures but with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The woman caught Sarah's eye and smiled. "First time?" the woman asked in a crisp English accent. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair neatly arranged under a blue hat and clothes that suggested comfortable prosperity. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah replied, grateful for human contact after the isolation of her morning walk. "Oh yes, dear. I can always spot the newcomers. You have that look of wonder mixed with complete bewilderment that all first-time visitors get. I'm Margaret, by the way. Margaret Thornton." The woman extended a gloved hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "Sarah Chen." She shook Margaret's hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that spoke of a lifetime of confidence. "I'm from Canada." "How lovely. And what brings you to our little circus this morning?" Margaret gestured toward the growing crowd of tourists, her tone suggesting amused affection rather than criticism. Sarah hesitated, then decided she had nothing to lose by telling the truth to a stranger she would never see again. She pulled out her grandmother's photograph and showed it to Margaret. "My grandmother passed away 3 months ago, and I found this photo among her belongings. She never told our family she had been to London. But here's the proof. I'm trying to understand the story behind it, Teddy." Margaret's expression changed as she examined the photograph. The casual friendliness was replaced by something more focused, almost intense. She looked from the photo to Sarah's face and back again several times, her eyebrows drawing together in concentration. "This is quite remarkable," Margaret said finally. "The uniform, the location, even the angle of the photograph. Your grandmother had exquisite timing. Do you see how the light is catching the guard's face just so? And the way she's positioned herself to get both the palace architecture and the ceremonial details in frame? This isn't a casual tourist snapshot. This was taken by someone who understood what they were capturing." Sarah felt a chill of excitement. "What do you mean?" "Well, for one thing, the quality of the photograph itself. In the 1950s, cameras weren't what they are today. Getting a shot like this would have required real skill and probably professional equipment. But more than that, look at the composition. Your grandmother knew exactly what story she wanted this image to tell." Margaret pointed to details in the photograph that Sarah had missed. The way the guard's position created a perfect line with the palace entrance in the background. The angle that captured both the formality of his stance and the subtle way his eyes were focused on the camera, or rather, on the person behind the camera. And this guard, Margaret continued. He's not just posing for a tourist photo. Look at his expression. There's something personal here, something that goes beyond duty. You can really see all that in this old photograph? Sarah asked, amazed by Margaret's analysis. My dear, I've been coming to this palace for 50 years. My late husband was a photographer for the London Times, and I learned to see pictures the way he did. But more importantly, I've watched thousands of tourists interact with the guards over the decades. What's captured in this image is something quite rare. Sarah felt her heart racing. Do you think there's any way to find out who this guard was? His name was Thomas Mitchell, according to my grandmother's letter. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. Thomas Mitchell, she repeated slowly. That name is familiar, though I can't place why. Tell me, what else did your grandmother reveal about their relationship? Sarah found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told Margaret about the letter, about her grandmother's claim that Thomas Mitchell had been the love of her life, about the circumstances that had separated them forever. As she spoke, she watched Margaret's face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition or disbelief. Your grandmother was Chinese? Margaret asked when Sarah finished her story. Yes, though she always claimed she never left China until she emigrated to Canada in 1962. This photograph proves otherwise, but I don't understand why she would lie about something like that. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. The 1950s were a very different time, especially for interracial relationships. If your grandmother was here as a student and fell in love with a British soldier, there would have been enormous social and political pressures against their relationship. Perhaps the circumstances that separated them weren't entirely by choice. This possibility had occurred to Sarah, but hearing it voiced by someone else made it feel more real and more heartbreaking. Do you think there's any way to find records of guards who served here in the 1950s? That's a very complex question, Margaret said carefully. Military records are often sealed, and the palace doesn't typically share information about personnel. But there might be other approaches: regimental histories, newspaper archives, perhaps even family connections if we could identify the right unit. We? Sarah asked, surprised by Margaret's use of the plural. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, she looked mischievous rather than serious. My dear, you've just presented me with the most interesting puzzle I've encountered in years. Besides, I suspect your grandmother's story is more significant than either of us realizes. There's something about this photograph, something about the timing and circumstances that feels important. As they spoke, Sarah became aware of a commotion near the palace gates. A group of tourists was clustering around something, their excited voices carrying across the courtyard. She looked toward the disturbance and saw what appeared to be the changing of the guard ceremony beginning, though it seemed early for the scheduled event. Oh, how perfect, Margaret said, following Sarah's gaze. You're about to witness something quite special. The morning inspection doesn't usually draw crowds like this, but today seems to be an exception. Sarah watched as the guards moved through their ceremonial routine with precision that bordered on the supernatural. Every movement was exactly timed, every step measured to the centimeter. These weren't just soldiers, they were artists performing a ritual that had remained unchanged for generations. She tried to imagine her grandmother standing in this same spot, watching a similar ceremony, perhaps seeing Thomas Mitchell among the participants. The guards who serve here, Margaret said, as if reading Sarah's thoughts, they come from specific regiments with long and distinguished histories: the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Scots Guards, among others. Each regiment maintains detailed records of its service members, though accessing those records requires the right connections. And do you have the right connections? Sarah asked hopefully. Margaret's smile became positively enigmatic. My dear, when you've lived in London as long as I have and your late husband spent decades photographing everyone from politicians to celebrities, you accumulate a rather extensive network of acquaintances. It might take a few phone calls, but I believe we can find someone willing to help us investigate your grandmother's mystery." As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Sarah felt a surge of optimism unlike anything she had experienced since beginning this journey. Meeting Margaret felt like more than coincidence. It felt like the first step in uncovering a truth that had been hidden for 70 years. "There's something else I should mention," Margaret said as they prepared to part ways. "The guards who serve at Buckingham Palace don't just disappear when their service ends. Many of them remain connected to their regiments for life. If Thomas Mitchell is still alive, if he stayed in England, there's a good chance someone in the current guard structure would know how to reach him, or at least know what happened to him." Sarah felt a flutter of nervous excitement. The possibility that Thomas Mitchell might still be alive had seemed too remote to seriously consider, but Margaret's confidence was infectious. "What would I say to him if we found him? How do you approach someone with news from a past they might have spent decades trying to forget?" "That's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it," Margaret said firmly. "For now, let's focus on the investigation itself. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? There's someone I'd like you to meet, someone who might be able to help us access the right records." As Sarah walked back through St. James's Park, the photograph now joined in her pocket by Margaret's business card, she felt the first real hope she had experienced since arriving in London. The city no longer seemed impossibly vast and anonymous. Instead, it felt like a place where connections could be made and mysteries could be solved, where the past and present could somehow find a way to communicate across the decades that separated them. The British National Army Museum sat quietly in the heart of Chelsea, its brick facade modest compared to the grand monuments scattered throughout London. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early for her appointment with Margaret, using the extra time to walk through the museum's ground floor exhibits. The walls were lined with centuries of military history, from medieval armor to modern conflict photography, each display representing countless individual stories of service and sacrifice. Margaret appeared precisely on time, accompanied by a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with the kind of posture that suggested a lifetime of military bearing. His gray hair was perfectly groomed, his clothes pressed to crisp perfection, and when he shook Sarah's hand, his grip conveyed both strength and courtesy. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Colonel David Hartley, retired," Margaret said with obvious pride in the introduction. David served with the Coldstream Guards for 30 years before transitioning to military history research. He's been kind enough to offer his assistance with our little investigation. Colonel Hartley smiled warmly, but Sarah could see the sharp intelligence behind his friendly demeanor. "Margaret has told me about your grandmother's photograph and the mystery surrounding this Thomas Mitchell. I must say, it's quite an intriguing puzzle. Shall we find somewhere more private to discuss the details?" They settled into a quiet corner of the museum's research library, surrounded by shelves of military histories and regimental records. Colonel Hartley pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal several photocopied documents and what appeared to be a detailed timeline. "I took the liberty of doing some preliminary research last night," he began, "and I've uncovered several interesting facts. First, the uniform details visible in your grandmother's photograph suggest this guard was indeed from the Coldstream Guards, based on the specific button spacing and ceremonial elements I can make out. You can determine his regiment just from the photograph? Military uniforms are quite specific, especially ceremonial dress. Each regiment has subtle differences that are invisible to civilians, but unmistakable to those who know what to look for. The Coldstream Guards have particular distinctions in their button groupings and insignia placement that match what I can see in this image." Colonel Hartley pointed to details in the photograph that Sarah had never noticed. "Furthermore, the timing is significant. The 1950s were a period of substantial reorganization for the household guards. Many traditional practices were being modernized, and detailed records were kept of personnel assignments, particularly for Buckingham Palace duty." He pulled out a thick folder filled with typewritten pages. "These are roster records for the Coldstream Guards stationed at Buckingham Palace between 1952 and 1955. I've located 3 soldiers named Mitchell who served during that period, but only one with the first name Thomas. Sarah's heart began racing. You found him? I found his service record. Yes, Thomas William Mitchell, enlisted 1948, assigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace from January 1953 through August 1954. Born in Yorkshire, parents listed as deceased, no immediate family contacts in his file. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. This is extraordinary progress for just one day of research. Colonel Hartley nodded, but his expression remained cautious. However, this is where the trail becomes more complex. According to these records, Private Mitchell requested transfer to overseas duty in September 1954. His transfer was approved, and he was assigned to the regiment's deployment in British Guyana. After that, the records become much more difficult to trace. What happened in British Guyana? Sarah asked, though she was already dreading the answer. The British military maintained several outposts in the region during the 1950s, primarily to support colonial administration and local security. It was considered a hardship posting, the kind of assignment typically requested by soldiers who wanted to disappear from their previous lives or who were dealing with personal difficulties. Sarah felt her optimism deflating. So he essentially vanished? Not necessarily, Colonel Hartley said carefully. What I can tell you is that soldiers who served in overseas postings during that era often remained abroad after their military service ended. Many married locally, established businesses, or found other reasons to stay. The transition from military to civilian life in a foreign country would have made maintaining contact with England quite difficult. Margaret had been studying the service records while they talked. David, what about family connections? Even if Thomas Mitchell remained overseas, surely there would be relatives back in England who might have maintained contact. That's where our investigation takes an interesting turn, Colonel Hartley said, reaching for another document. I've been in contact with a colleague who specializes in genealogical research for military families. According to his preliminary findings, Thomas Mitchell had one surviving relative at the time of his enlistment, a younger brother named James Mitchell. Sarah felt a spark of hope, reigniting. Is the brother still alive? James Mitchell died in 1987, Colonel Hartley said gently. But he had a family. 2 sons, both of whom settled in the London area. One of them, James Mitchell Jr., followed his uncle's path and joined the military. In fact, according to my records, he's currently serving with the Household Guards. The implications of this revelation took a moment to sink in. Margaret was the first to speak. You mean there's a nephew of Thomas Mitchell currently serving at Buckingham Palace? More than that, Colonel Hartley said with growing excitement. James Mitchell Jr., now Sergeant Mitchell, is currently assigned to ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. He's been part of the Queen's Guard rotation for the past 8 years. Jack gazed at the sudden acceleration of possibilities. Could we contact him? Would he be willing to speak with us about his uncle? Military personnel can't discuss family matters during official duties, Colonel Hartley explained, but there are appropriate channels for making contact. I could arrange an introduction through proper military protocol if you're interested in pursuing this. Of course I'm interested, Sarah said immediately, then hesitated. But what would I say to him? What if he knows nothing about his uncle's time in London? What if the family has painful memories they don't want to revisit? Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Those are valid concerns, but consider the alternative. You came here to honor your grandmother's final wish. You've already uncovered more information in 2 days than seemed possible when you started this journey. Regardless of what Sergeant Mitchell knows or doesn't know about his uncle's past, you owe it to your grandmother's memory to ask the questions. Colonel Hartley was already making notes on a small pad. I'll reach out to my contacts within the regiment today. It may take a day or 2 to arrange a proper introduction, but I'm confident we can make this happen. As they prepared to leave the museum, Sarah found herself looking at the military exhibits with new eyes. These weren't just displays of historical artifacts. They were representations of individual human stories. each uniform and medal connected to someone who had lived and loved and made choices that echoed across generations. Her grandmother's story was part of this larger tapestry of human experience, and now she was closer than ever to understanding how all the threads connected. Walking back through Chelsea toward the tube station, Margaret linked her arm through Sarah's in a gesture of companionship that felt both maternal and conspiratorial. "You know, dear, when I first saw that photograph yesterday morning, I had a feeling it was going to lead to something significant. But even I didn't expect to uncover a connection to current palace personnel. Do you think it's just coincidence that Thomas Mitchell's nephew ended up serving in the same position as his uncle?" Sarah asked. "In my experience, families often carry forward traditions and connections in ways that seem coincidental, but really aren't. Military service in particular tends to run in families. It's quite possible that James Mitchell Jr. grew up hearing stories about his uncle's service at Buckingham Palace and was inspired to follow the same path." That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room with her laptop open, trying to process the day's revelations. She had started this journey with nothing but a photograph and a dying woman's wish. Now she had names, dates, service records, and the possibility of speaking with someone who might actually remember Thomas Mitchell. She pulled up her email and began composing a message to her mother, trying to find words to explain how dramatically the situation had evolved. As she wrote, she kept glancing at her grandmother's photograph, propped against the lamp on her bedside table. The image seemed different now that she knew more of the story behind it. The formal pose and ceremonial setting couldn't hide the very human emotion captured in that moment between her grandmother and Thomas Mitchell. What had happened in 1954 to drive him to request overseas duty? Had their relationship become impossible due to social pressures, family objections, or political circumstances? Or had there been some other crisis that separated two people who clearly cared deeply for each other? More importantly, did Thomas Mitchell ever know that the woman he left behind spent 70 years wondering what had happened to him? Did he ever regret his decision to disappear from London, or had he found happiness elsewhere that made their separation worthwhile? These were questions that might never be answered, especially if Thomas Mitchell had indeed remained overseas and built a new life far from England. But the possibility of speaking with his nephew offered hope that some pieces of the puzzle might finally fall into place. Sarah closed her laptop and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring another step forward in her grandmother's story. For the first time since arriving in London, she felt like she was truly honoring Lily Chen's final request. She was uncovering the truth, piece by piece, and bringing her grandmother's love story out of the shadows where it had hidden for 7 decades. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself hoping that somewhere, somehow, her grandmother's spirit was aware of the progress being made. The investigation had become more than just fulfilling a dying wish. It had become a quest to understand how love could endure across time, distance, and the countless obstacles that life placed in its path. The phone call from Colonel Hartley came at 7 in the morning, waking Sarah from a restless sleep filled with dreams of palace guards and faded photographs. His voice carried an excitement that immediately dispelled any grogginess. "Sarah, I have remarkable news. Sergeant Mitchell has agreed to meet with you. But there's something quite extraordinary about the circumstances. Can you be at the Wellington Barracks at 2 o'clock this afternoon?" Sarah sat up in bed, her heart already racing. "Of course, but what do you mean about extraordinary circumstances?" "I think it's better if you hear this directly from Sergeant Mitchell himself. But let's just say that your grandmother's story has more layers than any of us anticipated." The Wellington Barracks, located just across from Buckingham Palace, housed the headquarters of the Guards Division. Sarah arrived early and spent time walking around St. James's Park, trying to calm her nerves and prepare for whatever she was about to learn. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, with golden leaves drifting from ancient trees and tourists moving in steady streams toward the palace gates. Colonel Hartley met her at the barracks entrance, his expression both excited and serious. "Before we go in, I need to prepare you for what you're going to hear. The conversation I had with Sergeant Mitchell yesterday revealed information that changes everything we thought we knew about your grandmother's story. They were escorted through corridors lined with military portraits and regimental colors, the walls telling the story of centuries of British military tradition. Sarah felt the weight of history around her, but more than that, she felt the anticipation of finally learning the truth about her grandmother's secret past. Sergeant James Mitchell was waiting in a small conference room, and the moment Sarah saw him, she felt a jolt of recognition. He was tall and lean like the guard in her grandmother's photograph, with the same strong jawline and direct gaze. But more than physical resemblance, there was something in his bearing that spoke of family connection across the decades. "Miss Chen," he said, standing as they entered the room. His voice carried the crisp authority of military training, but also a warmth that put Sarah immediately at ease. "Colonel Hartley has told me about your search for information about my Uncle Thomas. I believe I can provide some answers, though they may not be the answers you were expecting." They sat around a small conference table, and Sergeant Mitchell opened a folder that appeared to contain personal documents rather than official military records. "My Uncle Thomas never returned to England after his overseas posting in British Guiana. He died there in 1976, but before his death, he left behind a collection of personal papers that eventually made their way back to our family." Sarah felt a stab of sadness at learning definitively that Thomas Mitchell was gone. But Sergeant Mitchell's expression suggested there was more to the story. "Among his papers," the sergeant continued, "were dozens of letters that he never sent. All of them were addressed to a woman named Lily Chen in London. The letters span from 1954, when he first arrived in Guyana, until just weeks before his death, more than 20 years later." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. He continued writing to her for 20 years? "Not just writing," Sergeant Mitchell said gently. "In those letters, he poured out everything. His regrets about leaving London, his love for your grandmother, his hope that someday he would find the courage to return and make things right between them." Colonel Hartley leaned forward. "James, show her the photograph." Sergeant Mitchell reached into the folder and pulled out a picture that was clearly a companion to the one Sarah carried. It showed the same scene at Buckingham Palace, but from a different angle. In this version, her grandmother was looking directly at the camera, while Thomas Mitchell gazed down at her with an expression of absolute devotion. "My uncle kept this with him for the rest of his life," Sergeant Mitchell explained. "According to his letters, it was taken by a friend who was visiting London that day. Uncle Thomas treasured it because it captured the moment he realized he was completely in love with your grandmother." Sarah stared at the photograph, seeing her grandmother's face, young and radiant, in a way she had never witnessed in life. Why didn't he ever send the letters? Why didn't he come back? Sergeant Mitchell's expression grew somber. "That's the tragic part of this story. In his letters, Uncle Thomas wrote about a terrible misunderstanding that drove him to request overseas duty. Apparently, someone told him that your grandmother had become engaged to another man, someone from her own community who could provide the kind of life that a British soldier never could." "But that's not true," Sarah protested. "My grandmother never married until she met my grandfather in Canada, and that wasn't until 1965. "Exactly. Uncle Thomas discovered years later that the information was false, probably spread by someone who opposed their relationship. By then, he had been overseas for so long that he convinced himself your grandmother would have moved on with her life. He was afraid that contacting her after so many years would only cause her pain." Margaret had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she spoke up with barely contained emotion. "So they spent decades separated by a lie, each believing the other had chosen to move on. The letters make it clear that Uncle Thomas regretted his decision for the rest of his life. He wrote to your grandmother almost weekly, telling her about his life in Guyana, his work there, and most of all, his enduring love for her. But he never found the courage to actually send any of them." Sarah felt tears welling up as the full tragedy of the situation became clear. She died thinking he had forgotten her, and he died thinking she had forgotten him. "There's more," Sergeant Mitchell said quietly. He reached back into the folder and pulled out what appeared to be a more recent document. "Among Uncle Thomas's effects was information about your grandmother, that he had somehow acquired over the years. He knew she had emigrated to Canada. He knew about her restaurant business. And he knew about her family. Sarah's eyes widened. He was keeping track of her life for decades. He had newspaper clippings about her business success, photographs that he somehow obtained through mutual acquaintances, even information about her children and grandchildren. He knew about you, Sarah. There's a letter dated just 6 months before his death where he mentions a granddaughter who had become a teacher in Vancouver. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Sarah realized that her grandmother's love story hadn't ended in 1954 with Thomas Mitchell's departure for Guyana. It had continued, one-sided and secret, for more than 20 years as he documented her life from afar while pouring his heart out in letters he never sent. Did he ever try to contact her directly? Sarah asked. Sergeant Mitchell shook his head. According to his final letters, he came close several times. He even planned a trip to Canada in 1968, but ultimately decided that appearing in her life after so many years would be selfish. He convinced himself that she was better off without the disruption his return would cause. Colonel Hartley had been studying one of the letters while they talked. "There's something else here that I think you need to see, Sarah." In one of the later letters, your uncle mentions receiving a photograph from London taken at Buckingham Palace. He describes it as showing a young Chinese woman standing near the palace gates looking heartbreakingly familiar. Sarah felt a chill of premonition. What kind of photograph? Sergeant Mitchell consulted one of the letters. According to this, the photograph was sent to him by a former colleague who had remained in London. The colleague mentioned that the woman appeared to be searching for someone, asking questions about guards who had served at the palace in the 1950s. The pieces suddenly clicked together in Sarah's mind. My grandmother went back. She returned to London looking for him. It appears so, though we don't know exactly when or for how long. But Uncle Thomas received that photograph and recognized her immediately, even after all those years. In his letter about it, he wrote that seeing her face again, even in a stranger's casual photograph, convinced him that his feelings hadn't diminished with time. Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of the story that was emerging. Her grandmother hadn't just passively accepted Thomas Mitchell's disappearance. She had actively searched for him, perhaps multiple times over the years, and he had known about her search but still hadn't found the courage to reach out. The cruelest irony, Margaret observed, is that they were both looking for each other, both hoping for reconciliation, but neither had the information needed to make contact. There's one final thing I need to tell you, and this is why I was so eager to meet with you. In Uncle Thomas's last letter written just weeks before his death, he expressed a hope that someday, somehow, your grandmother would learn the truth about what happened between them. He wanted her to know that leaving London wasn't his choice, that he never stopped loving her, and that not a day passed without him thinking of what might have been. Sarah looked around the table at these three people who had become invested in her grandmother's story, and she realized that the impossible had happened. They had found the ending to Lily Chen's love story, even if it wasn't the happy ending anyone would have chosen. "Can I see the letters?" she asked quietly. Sergeant Mitchell smiled for the first time since their conversation began. "They belong to you now. Uncle Thomas wrote in his will that if anyone ever came looking for information about Lily Chen, all of his papers about her should be given to that person. He hoped that someday someone from her family would want to understand what really happened." As Sarah accepted the folder containing 20 years of unsent love letters, she felt her grandmother's presence more strongly than she had since the funeral 3 months earlier. The mystery was solved, but more than that, the love story finally had its witness. Thomas Mitchell's words would reach Lily Chen through her granddaughter, carrying across time and death the message he had never found the courage to deliver in life. 3 days had passed since Sarah received Thomas Mitchell's letters, and she had spent those days in her hotel room reading every word he had written to her grandmother over 2 decades. The letters painted a picture of a man tormented by a decision made in youth, who had spent his entire adult life wondering about the woman he had left behind in London. Now Sarah stood once again outside Buckingham Palace, but this time she wasn't alone. Margaret had insisted on accompanying her for what they were calling her grandmother's closure ceremony. Colonel Hartley and Sergeant Mitchell had also come, creating an unlikely group united by their investment in a 70-year-old love story. Sarah carried 2 photographs now. Her grandmother's original picture and the companion image that Thomas Mitchell had treasured until his death. She also held a letter she had written the night before, addressed to both her grandmother and Thomas Mitchell, telling them that their story had finally been heard. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret asked, gently, recognizing the emotional weight of the moment. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was ready for. The past week had upended everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the power of human connection across time and distance. She felt changed by the experience, carrying not just her grandmother's story, but also the responsibility of being the witness to a love that had endured despite impossible circumstances. As they approached the palace gates, Sarah noticed the changing of the guard ceremony was beginning. The precision and pageantry that had once seemed purely ceremonial now carried deeper meaning. Each soldier participating in this ancient ritual was someone's son, brother, father. Each uniform represented a human being with hopes, fears, and relationships that extended far beyond their military service. Sergeant Mitchell pointed toward one of the guards taking his position. "That's where my uncle would have stood during ceremonies in 1953. The position hasn't changed in decades." Sarah tried to imagine Thomas Mitchell in that spot, young and proud in his ceremonial uniform, unaware that his brief romance with a Chinese student would define the rest of his life. She wondered if he ever participated in ceremonies while thinking about Lily Chen, if the routine of military duty provided distraction from heartbreak or only emphasized what he had lost. The ceremony concluded, and the crowd of tourists began to disperse. Sarah remained at the gates, looking through the ironwork toward the palace beyond. Somewhere in those grand rooms, decisions had been made and traditions maintained, while 2 people who loved each other spent decades apart due to a cruel misunderstanding. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," Colonel Hartley said quietly. "You honored her final wish in a way that exceeded anything she could have imagined." Sarah smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I think she would be happy to know that Thomas never forgot her, that their love meant as much to him as it did to her." Margaret had been unusually quiet throughout the morning, but now she stepped closer to Sarah with an expression of purpose. "There's something else we need to discuss. Sergeant Mitchell and I have been talking, and we have a proposal for you." Sarah looked between them, curious about what they might have planned. Sergeant Mitchell took up the explanation. "My uncle's letters reveal that he established a small foundation in British Guyana, using his military pension and savings to provide educational opportunities for local children. The foundation still exists, though it's been struggling financially since his death. We were thinking," Margaret continued, "that perhaps your grandmother's story doesn't have to end with discovery. Perhaps there's a way to create something positive from all of this." Sarah wasn't sure where this was leading, but she was intrigued by the possibility of extending her grandmother's legacy beyond the resolution of an old mystery. Colonel Hartley produced a folder of documents. "We've researched the legal requirements, and it would be possible to establish a scholarship fund in both Thomas and Lily's names. The fund could provide educational opportunities for students who, like your grandmother, find themselves studying far from home and needing support to achieve their dreams." The idea was beautiful and unexpected, transforming a story of separated lovers into something that could help future generations. Sarah felt her grandmother's spirit in the suggestion, recognizing the kind of practical generosity that had characterized Lily Chen's approach to life. "The Thomas Mitchell and Lily Chen Educational Foundation," Sarah said, testing the sound of their names together. "They would have liked that." Uncle Thomas wrote extensively about the importance of education and opportunity. Combining that with your grandmother's success as an immigrant who built a new life through determination and hard work creates a perfect mission for such a foundation. As they discussed the practical details of establishing the scholarship fund, Sarah realized that her journey to London had evolved far beyond her original intention. She had come to fulfill a dying woman's wish, but she was leaving with a plan to honor 2 lives in a way that would impact countless others. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the palace courtyard when their conversation finally wound down. Sarah took one last look at the gates where her grandmother's photograph had been taken, then pulled out her phone to capture her own image of the scene. This time, she wasn't trying to recreate the past, but rather to document the conclusion of a story that had taken 70 years to tell. As they prepared to leave, a small commotion near the palace entrance caught their attention. A tourist had apparently stumbled while taking photographs, and one of the guards had broken from his rigid posture to help her regain her footing. The moment lasted only seconds before the guard returned to his ceremonial stance, but it reminded Sarah that beneath the formal uniforms and rigid protocols, these were human beings capable of kindness and quick response to others' needs. "That's exactly what Uncle Thomas would have done," Sergeant Mitchell said with obvious pride. "Military discipline never eliminated his basic decency." Margaret linked arms with Sarah as they walked back through St. James's Park. "You know, dear, when this all began, I thought we were simply solving a historical puzzle. I didn't expect to witness the creation of something new and meaningful from something old and tragic." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the letters in her bag and the lightness of purpose in her heart. "My grandmother always believed that every ending was also a beginning. I think she would see this foundation as proof that love doesn't really end, it just changes form." That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room for the last time, composing an email to her mother that attempted to capture the extraordinary week she had experienced. How could she explain that a simple photograph had led to military archives, unsent love letters, and plans for an educational foundation? How could she convey the sense of completion that came from finally understanding her grandmother's secret history? As she wrote, Sarah realized that her own life had been changed by this journey. She had discovered reserves of determination and courage that she hadn't known she possessed. She had learned that love could endure across decades and continents, that ordinary people could live extraordinary stories, and that sometimes the most important discoveries happened when we were brave enough to follow seemingly impossible paths. The foundation would take months to establish properly, requiring legal paperwork, fundraising, and coordination between organizations in England, Canada, and Guyana. But Sarah knew that her grandmother would have appreciated both the practical challenges and the meaningful outcome. Lily Chen had spent her life building something lasting from difficult circumstances, and now her granddaughter was doing the same. On her final morning in London, Sarah returned one last time to Buckingham Palace. This time she came alone, carrying only her grandmother's letter and the knowledge of how the story ended. She stood at the gates where it had all begun and spoke quietly to the spirits of 2 people who had loved each other across impossible odds. "Your story has been heard," she whispered. "Your love has been honored, and your names will help others achieve their dreams." As she turned to leave, Sarah caught sight of the familiar red uniform of a guard taking his position for the morning ceremony. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that somewhere in the pageantry and tradition of that ancient ritual, the love between Thomas Mitchell and Lily Chen continued to exist, transformed, but never forgotten. The flight home to Vancouver carried Sarah back to her regular life as a high school math teacher, but she was no longer the same person who had left Canada a week earlier. She had become the keeper of an extraordinary story and the founder of a foundation that would ensure 2 star-crossed lovers' names lived on in service to others. Most importantly, she had learned that some promises are too important to break even when they seem impossible to keep. Her grandmother's final wish had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations, proving that love, determination, and a willingness to believe in the impossible could still work miracles in the modern world. The Thomas Mitchell and Lily Chen Educational Foundation would open its doors the following year, providing scholarships for international students studying far from home. Each recipient would learn the story behind their support, ensuring that a 1950s romance between a British guard and a Chinese student would inspire new generations of dreamers to pursue their goals despite the obstacles that stood in their way. In the end, Sarah realized Her grandmother's love story hadn't been tragic after all. It had simply taken 70 years and traveled halfway around the world to find its proper ending.